today we have with us Sara Hossain, who's a lawyer and also the director of the Bangladesh Legal Aid. She has been voicing concerns about the recent arrests and cases that are being registered against lawmakers, ministers of the Awami League post Hasina's government fell on 5th of August. Now, it also does raise relevant questions on the student movement and its possible outcome. So she'll be talking to us today about this issue, as well as the reforms that are required in the judiciary in Bangladesh. Thank you for joining us. Thanks. So, ma'am, if you could just tell us about these concerns. Questions are now being raised post the arrest of several Awami League lawmakers, ministers, and many of them being accused of murder. So many of them, or about 100, 120 names are being put in murder cases. They are being charged with it. So many of them are being arrested. If you could tell us a little about that.
I think the first point for perhaps your viewers to know is that there have been mass killings in Bangladesh, and the mass killings happened while Sheikh Hasina was in office.
Right.
They happened with the police firing on unarmed protesters and peaceful protesters largely. So the biggest issue in front of us as a society right now is how do we get justice for those hundreds of people? We don't even know how many right now, many of whom were young people, younger than you, students, some of whom were children. One of the reports is indicating that there were over 80 children perhaps who were killed. So that's the hugest issue that we have, is how do we ensure justice for them? It's an enormous challenge. It would be an enormous challenge in any time, but it's a particularly difficult challenge at this moment, given that the largest number of allegations are against police and also some members of the security forces having been involved in that firing, right, as well as against the student wing and youth wing of the then ruling party, Awami League. So those cases have to be recorded and investigated. The challenge is that for many days the police were not even on duty. Yes. Another challenge remains that many of the police who were serving under Sheikh Hasina, many of whom were political recruits, also still remain in office in different places. So in that context, getting justice is very challenging. The new government has announced that it's going to set up a foundation through which the families of the bereaved families of those who've been killed during this movement will be able to approach and will be able to get reparations and other relief. But the issue of justice and accountability, of how who will be held accountable and how they will be held accountable, is very much an open question for us. You may have seen that these cases that are being filed are largely not being filed by state authorities. They're not being filed by the police. They're being filed by individual informants and family members who are coming forward. Right. So there's a question about the extent of information available to them, how much they're familiar with the process. We know that in our part of the world, we face two major challenges. We often have a problem that the police do not accept when victims go to try and lodge complaints at the police station to seek justice. We've seen this in the last week or two happening as well. There have been incidents when not only the individual victim's family, but they've had to be supported by others, by activists and others, being with them, sitting for hours and hours, for 10 hours in some cases, 12 hours in some cases, in police stations, just to make sure that their complaint can be recorded. So I think the first point to note is the victims of these killings are only just beginning their path to seek justice. It's a very thorny and very challenging path. It's not easy. The second concern I think we have is that the manner in which these cases are being filed, or many of the cases are being filed at the moment, appears problematic in that there are many names given of those who instigated or abetted the killing, but the names of those who were directly involved in the killing, police officers and or others, certainly what we saw on our television screens and many people witnessed themselves directly who were on the streets, was that it was not only police and members, for example, the border guards, but it was also ruling party members of the youth wing and the students wing. So those names are not apparently obvious in many of these FIRs, many of these reports that have gone to the police. So I think that's raising concerns about, will those who were directly involved in these killings, will they be held accountable? And also by including names of many people who may have had nothing to do with the incident in question, will the process of justice be irretrievably, muddied and confused? And will the victims of these killings not receive justice at the end of the day?
Right, because we've been seeing also that, cases were registered against journalists, some arrests were made. So is it that it's a big question on the efficacy of the current interim government or the police that is functioning. Also, it makes us think that are we is Bangladesh really making the past mistakes that the Awami League had made?
It's 2 weeks since this, or 2 weeks and a little bit since this interim government came into place. And during these 2 weeks and a bit, they face multiple challenges. As you may know, we're in the middle of a huge flood,
right,
where people simply aren't even being able to survive. So I think we have to take account of the fact that it's not exactly a normal time, that there are multiple challenges being faced. And as I said, the police force themselves are in not complete, but considerable disarray still. They're not reconstituted, they're not recomposed. So I think there are a lot of challenges before them. I think what would help and what we need, I think, is some more direction from, we could, I think, benefit from some direction from the interim government on how the process of justice should unfold and how victims should be supported in this process of seeking justice, so that they are not left high and dry by processes that are ongoing, that are not going to help them to reach their destination. And I think, again, we need to remember that this interim government is in place for these 2.5 weeks. But we have had innumerable experiences, not only in the past 15 years, but earlier, of victims of human rights violations, or victims of murders, or victims of serious crimes not being able to obtain justice. It's not common to Bangladesh. I believe you're quite familiar with it in India also, that it's extremely difficult for many people to seek justice in cases of human rights violations. We're seeing the same situation here. But I think that what we don't want to see, and I think the interim government and also the chief advisor has been very clear, that while their priority is to ensure justice for all of the victims of the killings during the protests and all of the other human rights violations that have occurred, they don't want any further injustice to take place. So I'm hoping that there will be early directions from the interim government on how to now address the concerns that have been flagged by many citizens. And also the question you raised, I think, about cases we're seeing against journalists and others. Again, perhaps you're not aware of it in India, but in Bangladesh, we've had a huge, I think you have, again, similar problems in India, actually, which is we've had a huge section, unfortunately, of our media, both printed, but particularly broadcast, that has, for many people, not been seen as performing journalistic duties. In other words, acting with integrity and independence to hold the government to account. And instead, what we've seen is a kind of, I guess, at best we could call it a client media, or worse, a kind of propaganda machinery. Now, having said that, you shouldn't be being accused of murder because you've been involved in propaganda, or you may have been. There may be many allegations also now of corruption, of defamation, of hate speech. Now, if those are the offences, those are the offences for which action should be taken. Whether it's hate speech, whether it's defamation, whether it's instigating violence against others. You've also seen instances of instigating not only violence but hatred, maligning members of the opposition, maligning civil society figures, maligning of human rights activists. All of that has happened should come out and should be, we should know the truth of what happened in the name of upholding the system we saw until a few days ago. But doing that doesn't mean translating everything into a murder case. So I think we have to understand there's enormous rage, enormous anger, enormous despair and resentment in many people's hearts about what they've had to face and go through, and the fact that people have been muzzled for a very long time and not been able to speak about these issues. So I think a lot of that is just being vented out. But of course, an FIR is not the place to vent one's rage and grievance. There, things have to be done according to law and properly. And I think that we need to see that the police are performing their functions in accordance with law. Where they're not doing so, they also need to be held to account. And I think that, we're all encouraged by the chief advisor's statement that they are committed to seeking justice, and they want to ensure that no injustice is committed in that process. But I think we also now need to see action following those words.
Right. Ma'am, the sentiment that we get from the ground is reform before election. Most of the people are talking about reforms in the police department, reforms in judiciary, economy. So a lot needs to be done. And, there are several challenges that are there in front of the interim government. So talking about judiciary particularly, what immediate reforms you think are required in the system? Because there have been several allegations of politicization of the judiciary. We saw such a massive protest where the Supreme Court Chief Justice had to step down.
Again, another situation which again has not been widely, reported or documented worldwide, I think, is that several years ago, our former Chief Justice, Justice Sinha, who's now spoken about this in public, and finally been reported on it in the Bangladesh media, which wasn't possible for so many years. Justice Sinha has spoken about how he was compelled to leave the country at gunpoint, compelled to leave his office after being threatened, essentially, by the previous government. So I think, again, we need to look at the context in which the judiciary has been operating, the fact that that kind of action could take place. And we were in a situation where neither lawyers nor judges could seek any kind of remedy against that, meant that there was already tremendous threat over the judiciary. So at this point, again, I think we need judicial reforms. We definitely need, we need all manner of everyday normal judicial reforms that every system across South Asia needs, tackling delays, tackling backlogs, tackling the challenges of people who are seeking justice. But we also need to do more fundamental reforms as well to address issues around corruption, around politicization. But whatever reforms we have, I think it's very important we have them according to a process. This judgment that, in fact, Justice Sinha's last landmark judgment was holding that any actions against the higher judiciary should be through the process of a Supreme Judicial Council. So I think one of the urgent actions that awaits us is the formation of that Supreme Judicial Council, and for that to take the necessary action. That, if there are complaints, and there are many complaints, that those complaints should be duly lodged and they should be dealt with by the Judicial Council. I think given the context we're in, it's important that we not enter a process of endless delay, and that, that people feel that they need to see action. There should not be precipitate action, but there has to be action with process in a reasonable period of time so that people feel that changes are happening. Because I think people have lived with a lot for a very long time and seen a lot of injustice, and they need to see the change in front of them.
You have been working in human rights. You've been working in legal aid. What was it like to be a lawyer in Hasina's regime last 15 years?
I think it's always challenging for any lawyer working on human rights in Bangladesh, in pretty much under any government. We've seen police abuse of power. We've seen endemic corruption. We've seen politicization across different systems. But I think that the thing that was different in the last 15 years, we obviously have had democratic change until 15 years ago, right? And before that, we had 2 years of a state of emergency. But prior to that, the situation we faced was 5 years of one government, 5 years of another. One could have better systems, but at least that change meant that there was some level of check and balance with different administrations coming and going. What we've seen with 15 years untrammeled, without any effective democratic elections in the meantime, is that every institution has been deeply politicized at very many different levels, and that there's absolutely no check and balance at all on one on another. So we've seen a parliament which doesn't have an effective opposition. I think you witnessed what happened with the last elections. Most people didn't vote. There are no different parties in parliament. Everybody's on the same side. That's not any objectively understandable idea about how a parliament or a democracy functions. Yeah. So many things in that sense, basically what's happened in many of our institutions have been hollowed out from inside. Mm. So within that context, it's been very, very challenging to ensure protection of human rights, and particularly challenging. It's been possible in some areas, for example, on some issues around where there hasn't been a direct confrontation with state authorities, it's still been possible to secure some rights and remedies, of course, through the courts. But when people have dealt with civil and political rights, and I would say particular issues on which we haven't dealt so much directly. I work with the Legal Aid Organization, which is a non-governmental organization, works mainly for people who can't afford to go to the courts or who are from marginalized communities. But for political actors, and particularly for those who are in the political opposition, they've experienced extremities, I think, in terms of human rights violations. And what they've also experienced is their issues have not really been documented, have not been responded to, whether it's by bodies like the Human Rights Commission, who haven't responded at all, or even by the courts. In fact, they've seen, I think, maybe that's the key point. They've seen a kind of, and gone through a process of judicial harassment themselves. And we've seen also with civil society actors, several have faced what I would call judicial harassment. That not only have they faced false and vexatious cases, but they haven't got remedy and relief through the court. That process of harassment has been continued and exacerbated through what's happened inside the judiciary. So I think those things are distinctive and different from what we normally face at different times.
So this transition was inevitable. I mean, everybody saw it coming.
I think no one saw it coming. There was a movement in the beginning of June, which was about the quota reforms. I think if there had been any level of political sagacity and any level of engagement, perhaps it wouldn't have come to this. But I think by this extreme intransigence, refusal to acknowledge that people can have grievances, and the insistence on turning anyone with a grievance, however rational, as in the quota movement demands, turning them into traitors, turning them into anti-nationals, turning them into terrorists, that depiction of people, and then ultimately taking these extreme measures of indiscriminate firing on huge sections of your own citizenry, including young people and children. I think that's what made it inevitable. I think prior to that, we may have lived under oppression for many years more.
So that 1 week, when we are talking about when the police was not on the ground, 44 of the policemen were killed. So they went on a strike saying that we won't be on the ground. So there was complete lawlessness, complete chaos. The incidents that happened in those days when there was no police, nothing was functioning. So if there was no police, there were no cases registered, there were no arrests happening, nobody went to the court. How is it that, whatever happened in those days, those couple of days where there was complete lawlessness, how will those perpetrators be brought to book? I mean, this is a massive challenge even before the police. And what about the courts? Have they resumed functioning? Are arrests happening? Because I did speak to a couple of
I think, as I said, it's a huge challenge for us because all of our institutions, including the judiciary, have been deeply politicized and at very many different levels. So there's been a transition in terms of Sheikh Hasina leaving the country, but she's also left the country in a situation without ensuring any kind of peaceful transition. We've had transitions of power before. We've had a movement against General Rashad in 1990. Right. We had another movement when the BNP didn't deliver on a fair election back in 2006, and we had a state of emergency. At both those times, there were negotiations and there were systems put in place. So there was a peaceful transfer of power. There were police on the streets. And the second time, there was also army on the streets. When Sheikh Hasina left, she left considering only her own security and safety and not considering the safety of her fellow party members and forget the safety of citizens. So we had this terrible situation for several days when police were not only, I think, absent because police officers had been killed, police were also absent because police had been killing people right until late into the day on the 5th. I know for a fact that they were beating people, beating young people, young lawyers, men and women with rods and sticks right up until 1 o'clock on the 5th of August, an hour or two before Sheikh Hasina left the country. So in that situation, I think many police didn't appear in front of the crowds that they had been killing until a few hours before. So that's the situation we were in. And it is going to be very hard coming out of that situation. But the fact we are now 3 weeks on, we do have courts functioning. We have the majority of police stations back in operation. The transition has to be now managed peacefully and people need to move forward. I think what we've seen in the last few days with also terrible floods striking large sections of the country is that many people have come together to deal with the crisis that comes. 2 days ago, we saw the entire secretariat, which is where our civil service is located in Dhaka city. The secretariat was being attacked by Ansars. Yes. And unfortunately, we saw being encouraged on social media by people, including Sheikh Hasina's son, very actively encouraged. And we saw that members of the interim government were inside the secretariat at the time, and the student groups came together. And after the students came, we saw then the army and police sort of stepped up again and provided the necessary protection and diffused the situation. So it's a really volatile situation still. There is a transition that's happened that's been greeted by many people across the country. There are obviously huge fears about whether the transition will continue successfully or not. Huge challenges to ensure transition in different institutions peacefully and through some process so that we can do the task of reform and restoration. But I think we have to meet those challenges and see how we can do it, and do it in a way that human rights are not violated. There are concerns now, serious concerns about the manner in which cases are being lodged against individuals, whether practices from the past, from the very immediate past, are simply being continued, and whether that is being continued also to undermine this government. It's not clear whether it's being done by the government at the very top, but there's a great space between the interim government at the very top, a few people who are trying to steer this transition through, and all of the machinery underneath them. How much of that is machinery they can rely on, how much of it is machinery that works, and how much of it is obviously continuing the culture and practices that have been embedded for so many years.
In fact, we've been seeing a lot of protests that are happening across Dhaka. Yesterday only I saw 3 of them. One was a group of young girls, class 9 and 10, protesting, saying that our principal was a Hasina loyalist, so she must step down. So when I asked them, what did she do? They said she was corrupt. So I said, okay, how do you say that? No, we don't know she was corrupt. And some rickshaw pullers were protesting yesterday, saying that our name should be included in the 1971 war liberation war heroes. So how do you see these sporadic incidents happening? I mean, it's a complete, when I spoke to officials, they said, yes, it is messy, would need some time to really streamline things. But right now, protests have become the flavor of the season.
Well, I guess if you look at it positively, the good thing is people are being able to speak out and make their demands, and they may not have been able to do that quite so easily a few days ago. So that's definitely positive. But I think it's also important to recognize that while many people have many grievances, firstly, they need to be prioritized.
Right.
Everything can't be dealt with overnight. And secondly, that in pursuing grievances or in seeking remedies or relief, we should be very, very cautious about not perpetrating new wrongdoings. It's simply not the case that everyone who is holding any office or carrying out any official responsibilities before the 5th of August was necessarily a criminal or necessarily corrupt. There was enormous criminality. There has been huge corruption. It will take a lot to investigate it all and to start undoing it. Some of it may not even happen. It may be impossibly difficult. So I think that task of prioritization has to take place. And in the meantime, it's very important that I think, we heed what the chief advisor also said in his speech a couple of days ago, that we shouldn't be taking the law into our own hands. I think students have and continue to play a really important role in terms of raising issues of conscience, taking action where they've seen things that are going wrong. But they also now have to, continue on a more rational path and start doing business as usual. We need to have schools and colleges back at work. Our courts are back at work. I mean, to start functioning. So I think students will remain an important voice of conscience. I don't think they're going to forget what they've done. And I think they're still very actively involved, as we saw 2 days ago, in trying to respond when there are violent outbreaks. And they're playing a role in that. But, it's going to be a process through which everyone needs to get back into their own spaces and also see how they can safeguard this change and safeguard it in a way that more people are not put at risk.
Right. Just last 2 questions, ma'am. One is about the politics of Bangladesh. What do you see going ahead? Because now BNP is, of course, one of the largest parties that will play a crucial role if elections are announced. Then there is a factor of Jamaat-e-Islami as well that a lot of people are talking about. So how do you see this happening? Are new faces required in the politics of Bangladesh so that dichotomy of Awami League, BNP, then BNP, Awami League has to end?
I don't think we've seen a dichotomy. We've seen a one-party situation now for about 10 plus years, almost 15 years, in fact. So I think we just need to see a plurality of politics, and we need to see people being able to engage in political activity without being criminalized for it. That's important. And I think we should have different, people of different views, different beliefs, different approaches should be able to participate in political life. I mean, that's what democracy is, and that we should be able to respond to politicians with whom we don't agree by doing our own politics rather than clapping everyone into jail or calling everyone a terrorist or calling everyone an anti-national, which is what we've been seeing for many years. But I do think we have to have multiple views, multiple parties, and the parties that have played a role in Bangladesh over the years should be there. There may be new formations that come up as well. We should have some time, I think, for that process to evolve.
Right. Last question, ma'am. There's a lot of anger among the common Bangladeshis as far as India is concerned. I went on the ground and spoke to a lot of people, students, people who are working in private offices, and they gave us a host of reasons. One being that Hasina is still in India. We are giving her shelter. Then they talked about how India turned a blind eye completely to the atrocities that were happening in back home in Bangladesh, and how we were the first ones to basically congratulate Hasina in the third term when she was re-elected. So why is there so much anger? Another point they made was the media coverage in India related to the minority attacks that unfortunately happened. But they said that this was not targeted at minorities. I mean, this would happen in any such big transition that happens. I mean, some lumpen elements are there in most of these situations whenever they happen. What is your take on that?
Well, my take is firstly to make a distinction between Indian people and the Indian government. So I think that there is no question that people in Bangladesh have deep and lasting ties with people in India and deep and close friendships, whether they're cultural, whether they're professional, whether they're personal. And I think those things have to continue, of course, and we all want that, to be built and to be made stronger. But I think the concern is over these last few years, what we've seen is, even if we talk about these last few weeks and months, what we've seen is kind of from the Indian state and Indian authorities, and also from large sections of the Indian media, which we understand are also quite compliant with official views, a complete denial that anything is happening in Bangladesh and a subscription to that same false narrative that anyone who is a dissenter, anyone who is an oppositionist, anyone who is mildly critical is somehow at worst a terrorist, at best an anti-national element, and perhaps some kind of criminal, constructed as a criminal. So I think seeing that happening so easily and so widely, the same thing with the rather terrible attacks that happened from the 5th of August onwards on groups such as, we've heard a lot in the Indian media about attacks on Hindu families. There have also been attacks on Adivasi families, on Ahmadiyya community, which is Muslim sect across different parts of Bangladesh. All of that is condemnable, and we've seen less in the Indian media on the fact that many Bangladeshis have immediately sought to support and protect their friends and neighbors. That students themselves who led this movement also rushed wherever they found information that attacks like this were happening to be of service to them. Communal threats are not uncommon in South Asia. We see a lot in India, which is deeply disturbing, about people being lynched and no recourse to justice. And we don't see officials in India often condemning actions like that. We see condemnation in more critical press in India, but not from large swathes of the electronic media and others. So I think in that context, what we've seen in Bangladesh is not at all something one can gloss over. It's very disturbing. It's very important that the interim government takes measures to restore confidence in people right across the nation, from whatever community they belong to, that where we see that there are people who've taken this opportunity of lack of law enforcement on the ground to settle old scores, to attack communities that they see as vulnerable, to try and grab properties. Many of the situations we went and looked at in the last couple of weeks were places where there's been ongoing dispute over property or land. And someone has taken that opportunity, knowing there are no police on the ground, there are no army nearby, to rush in and try and destroy someone's home or threaten the families or ask them to leave and so on. So we've seen those situations, but I think in Bangladesh, we all want to repair that situation and move on. We don't want to deny what happened. It happened. It happened in front of people. There's no point denying that these attacks have happened. And I think there's also no point saying that these attacks are purely actions of political reprisal. They happened against people who do belong to the Ahmadiyya community, the Hindu community, Adivasis, who are not numerically the majority in this country. So there's obviously an important function, there's an important role that others who are in the majority, whether we agree with these, who's a majority, who's a minority, everyone is a citizen of Bangladesh, but some citizens are more vulnerable because of their community and their identity, and it's a responsibility of others to stand by them. So I think one of the things that has really caused a lot of this, several things that has caused this anger amongst much of the Bangladesh population over the last few weeks is that a terrible situation that happened in Bangladesh with fellow Bangladeshis facing attack from and after the 5th of August, instead of that being seen as something that you stand in solidarity with people, you investigate, you find out what happened, who's responsible, hold them to account, and support and assist those who've been attacked to build their lives back. Instead of that, there was just this blanket demonizing of everyone in Bangladesh, turning the whole thing into again, communalizing the entire thing. I think that's what's really been the most upsetting, that we've seen large sections of the Indian media communalizing what has happened in Bangladesh, calling everyone in Bangladesh an Islamist, which is not the case, and saying all these attacks were by Islamists against others, which is also not the case, and not choosing to understand the facts on the ground, not reporting responsibly on what's happened. If that were to happen, I think a lot of and we've seen more recently, of course, other media have come up and have taken a more complex approach, tried to hear different voices, understand what's happened. But the lack of that kind of on-the-ground perspective and the willingness to simply repeat, echo, and amplify the narrative that was produced by the Awami League is what's been concerning. I think if the Indian media, and even more importantly, Indian authorities, listen to what people in Bangladesh are saying and try to recalibrate and reframe their response accordingly, we can reset this relationship, because there's no question that India and Bangladesh have to have friendly relationships, and Indian and Bangladeshi people already have them. And the kind of anger that has been created, I need to just sort of say two other points. I think one is about the violence, the other is about the kind of political narrative, but the third also has been this whole flooding situation. We have a long-standing disputes regarding water sharing and so on. So those are also very fundamental questions. There are other economic issues that are very fundamental. So I think we just need a big reset in terms of India-Bangladesh relations, recognizing we're an independent sovereign nation. We will chart our own course. We have our own interests, and those do need to be respected. We can't be just told what to do. And particularly in terms of human rights and security issues, we need to make sure we chart our own path, and that we're not being subjected to and being taught how to carry out certain kinds of human rights violations. One of the most disturbing things we saw was these blindings that occurred of protesters, people being shot straight into the eye. And there are a number of young people now who are permanently blinded in one eye for life. We've seen similar things across the border in India as well, in particular sections of particular, states of India where there have been protests. There have been these kinds of patterns of protesters being blinded in the eye. We really don't want to see India sharing its worst practices with us. Rather, it should be turned around, and this should be a moment when there's a reset and an improvement in seeing how we can share the positive parts of each other's cultures and practices, and move away from the experiences that we've had.
All right. Thank you so much for being with us, ma'am.
Sure.
That was really an enlightening discussion that we had with you. Thank you for watching.